Welcome. I'm Jessica Green, and together with Reverend Dr. Zina Jacque and Claire Nelson, we welcome you to Courageous Conversations, produced by Urban Consulate at Barrington's White House. Thank you for joining us to explore how to foster greater inclusion and belonging in our community. This year, we are proud to be part of a groundswell of community members coming together to nourish a culture of belonging in Barrington and beyond. Everyone is invited to be a part of this initiative running through May. You can join by adding your name at webelongtoeachother.org and displaying the message in your home or at work or by hosting an event or even just starting a conversation about why belonging matters to you. Could you think of imagining sparking a dialogue in your home or school or workplace, in your faith or civic group, sports team, arts and culture clubs, or small businesses, or wherever you gather around this topic? Posing a question like, what does belonging mean to you? Or when do you feel like you belong? Or what is a way you can extend a sense of belonging is a great way to start. So visit the website at webelongtoeachother.org to learn more about community events and actions, and find tools and resources, download logos and quotes, submit stories and testimonials, or you can actually get signs and supplies in the corner over there. So we have 3 upcoming events that we want to highlight with regards to the Belonging Initiative. On March 14th at 4 p.m. at Nectar, Be Strong Together and Barrington Youth and Family Services is doing a Belonging for Teens pop-up. Registration can be done online with BYFS or Be Strong. And then on Wednesday, April 12th, 7 p.m. here at Barrington's White House, we're thrilled to welcome Tony Award-winning actress Ali Stroker to our spring season finale for Courageous Conversations. When Ali won the Tony Award for Best Featured Actress in a Musical for her role as Ado Annie in Oklahoma, she made history as the first actor in a wheelchair to do so. In her moving acceptance speech, she said, "This award is for every kid who has a disability, who has a limitation or challenge, who has been waiting to see themselves represented in this arena." Hi, welcome, come on in. You're welcome to come and find a seat. Since then, you may have seen her in television shows including Glee, Ozark, and Only Murders in the Building, or on stage at Carnegie Hall, Kennedy Center, or Lincoln Center. She's the author of 2 children's books, The Chance to Fly, and Allie and the Sea Stars. Allie was also a founding member of Be More Heroic, an anti-bullying campaign connecting artists with students across the country. What can we learn from Allie about advocating for inclusion, expanding representation, and ending ableism? Join us to welcome her to Barrington and invite a friend. So tickets are available at barringtonswhitehouse.com or courageouscommunity.us. And again, that's April 12th. It's our last one of the season. And then on Friday, April 28th, 7:30 p.m. here at Barrington's White House, the Humanities Working Group of the Barrington Cultural Commission is hosting a special storytelling event with the theme, I Knew I Belonged When. So save the date for a fun evening of storytelling hosted by professional storytellers Jim May and Megan Wells. Tickets are $20 and can be purchased at barringtonswhitehouse.com/events or at the door. The presentation will be both live and virtual. So if you've got a story about this, the Barrington Cultural Commission has an online application form with a submission deadline of March 28th, and submitters will be notified by March 31st. So if you are selected, you will have the opportunity to be coached by a professional storyteller to help shape your short story. Stories should be of your own true experience, whether it be humorous, serious, thoughtful, or inspirational. And the stories should be family-friendly, no longer than 5 minutes, and you're not allowed to read. So I can't do that because I have to read everything. We hope you apply. Okay, over the last 4 years, we couldn't produce this Courageous Conversation series without your ticket purchases and the generous support of our sponsors. So please join us in thanking Barrington Area Community Foundation, BMO Wealth Management, Kim Duchessois, Tyler and Danielle Lenchuk, Kobe and Eric Struckmeyer, Young Chung, Susan and Rich Padula, Carol and David Nelson, Dennis and Stacy Barsima, Julie Kanak and Mike Regali, and my husband, Dominic Green. We also want to thank you. We also want to thank Barrington's White House, Barrington Area Library, and Be Strong Together, who have been wonderful partners in this programming from the start. So another round of applause for them, please. We're live streaming tonight, and as always in our dialogues, we invite you to hold our 6 grounding virtues from On Being, which are listed over here. Generous listening, humility, patience, hospitality, adventurous civility, and words matter. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our topic for tonight, how to be an upstander. The language we use and how we treat one another matters deeply. When confronted with words or behaviors that are harmful, how can we best respond? This is a question we have explored in different ways throughout this series, and it's one that sadly never gets old because we continue to experience it interpersonally, in casual everyday conversations and interactions, as well as communally, in public spaces and civic forums and schools and community spaces, and of course, online. Finding our voices to say or do the right thing in the right way with the best intention and impact is one of the hardest things to figure out. Often we get so disoriented trying to figure out how best to respond in alignment with our own values and integrity and in right relationship with our community that we find ourselves either, one, reacting strongly, hastily, sloppily, and potentially mimicking some of the dehumanizing behavior we seek to transform, or two, getting paralyzed with overanalyzing and then saying or doing nothing. So we're trying to find that third way that we can feel we can be proud of. We are really, just a side note, fortunate to have the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie, and they focus on upstanding work. And so it's a great place to take your kids or your grandkids if you want to explore more about how to be an upstander. This is something that they specialize in, so I just wanted to give a quick pitch for that. But tonight, there is no better person to help guide us through this than our special guest, Jenan Mohajir. Jenan is the Senior Director of Special Projects for Interfaith America, a national organization based in Chicago that works to inspire, equip, and connect leaders and institutions to unlock the potential of America's religious diversity. In her role at Interfaith America, Jenan focuses on building strategic relationships and programs with new partners across emerging sectors. Inspired by faith and family to work for change at the intersections of gender, sexuality, race, and religion, Jenan has served in leadership at Interfaith America for 15 years, where she has trained hundreds of interfaith leaders from diverse backgrounds to foster a vision and practice of civically engaged interfaith leadership. Jenan completed undergraduate work at DePaul University and is pursuing her MA in Religious Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary. As a natural storyteller, she performs with Second Story, Chicago's premier storytelling company. Jenan proudly lives on the south side of Chicago with her children and loves to collect vintage children's books. Before we welcome Jenan up, Zina, I welcome you to come and give us an opening. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. An upstander. Do you know what it is? I had to look it up too, so don't be embarrassed. A person who speaks or acts in support of an individual or group, particularly someone who intervenes on behalf of a person being attacked or bullied. When you think about the word bystander, that you just stand and look, then upstander really begins to take on new meaning. You stand up in that moment and join, particularly the person who's being bullied or attacked. We'll learn so much more about that tonight. But setting that in context becomes helpful. And if I've gotten it wrong, my sister and my friend Jenan will correct me. I have no worries about that. Have you ever been in a space where someone has said something that was hurtful, that bullied, and your tongue was tied? Didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond, and maybe a day and a half later, it came to you, but the circumstance had passed. Part of what we want to do tonight is to practice, is to literally practice. So when those moments, because they will happen, when they happen again, you and I will have language. But here's what just arrested me about tonight. We've titled this, How to Be an Upstander. And the word how is pivotal. I didn't even know what part of speech how was, but it's an adverb. And if you go to Merriam-Webster and you look up how, here's what you're going to get. How means in what manner or in what way. How can we settle language in our heart that prepares us to do this work? In what manner, in what way can we settle that language? How means for what reason? how will I know what to say? What's the reason behind it? How will I know what is the truth for me to interrupt this conversation? For what manner, for what reason? How will I know what to say? How means to what effect? How am I going to interrupt? To what effect will my interrupting have in this moment? What will happen if I interrupt? That's the how that we're studying tonight. It also means to what degree or to what extent. How much longer, to what degree, to what extent? How much longer do we have to wait until this won't be necessary? And how do we stay fired up to be upstanders? And finally, you've asked this question a dozen times. You've asked somebody, how do you feel? Because how means in what state or in what condition do you find yourself? How do you feel when you hear those words? What moves in you, and how can we harness that for the greater good? For the greater good, not just of the circumstance that's around it, but for our greater good. Because when we are trained to be upstanders, we understand in a whole different way our agency and our power in the world. And so when you and I are prepared to move into that space, just by being there, we change the atmosphere. You know, you can lift your eyebrow and change a whole conversation. To what effect do we do this work? Well, the effect is to make the world better. I'm going to commission you now as upstanders. And I'm going to do it because I'm aspirational. Because I believe you're only here because we want to be better upstanders. So you are now commissioned. You will go from this place with talent and skill and practice to be an upstander. And we could not be in more capable hands tonight than in my sister Jenan's hands. So Jenan, we welcome you to this place.
Good evening. Good evening. I hope you all can hear me okay. All right. My name is Jenan Mohajir. I'm with Interfaith America, which is a nonprofit based out of Chicago that does work nationally across the country. And I'm not supposed to move around because we also have friends joining. Sorry. Thank you. So I will start here. One of our foundations at Interfaith America is to start with stories, because stories anchor people into their experiences, they anchor people into their lives, and that gives us a window into the ways that they are navigating and understanding the world that is happening around them. So I want to start today with a story. And that is the story of I don't know where my clicker went. Here it is. And that is the story of my family. So I'm Muslim. I was born in India. My parents are from the subcontinent. I grew up in the Middle East. My parents were expats who lived in Qatar until they were, or actually into their adulthood. And when I was around 16 is when my family moved to the suburbs of Chicago, where I have lived ever since. As a Muslim, one of the foundational poets in my home was Rumi. And there's a line by Rumi that you'll see on the screen where it says, "The wound is where the light enters you." So the story I wanted to share with you today is actually a story that's not mine. It's the story of my son. So I have 3 kids. They are 11, 8, and 7. And in 2017, when my 11-year-old was 5 or 6, I can't do math, we were sitting around our morning breakfast table on a Saturday when we heard news that the Chicago Loop Synagogue, which was not too far from our home on the south side of Chicago, had been vandalized. The front windows had been broken, they were smashed, and there was a swastika sticker placed on its door. And as we sort of looked at this news and were trying to figure out, how do we show up as neighbors in this moment? What does it mean to be present in this moment and be in community? And I was having a conversation with my then husband, and my son sort of raised his hand and said, "I have a question. The man who broke that window, is he going to break our window too?" That's him when he was, I think, 7 or something. And to be quite honest, I was a little bit speechless when he asked me that question, because I wasn't quite sure how to answer it. I wasn't sure if I should say, no, of course not. We're safe. We're safe here, and we're safe in our community. And to be quite honest, in those days, I couldn't say that with full confidence based on what was happening around us. We could have said, no, we're not safe, right? And that would incite anxiety in him. And I was not willing to do that either. So instead, we put the question to him and said, yeah, this happened. What do you think we should do? And he said, well, I think we should make cards. And we were like, okay, that sounds good. So we made cards and rearranged our Super Bowl Sunday schedule so that we could go and visit the synagogue with some cards and some flowers and all 3 of our kids. And it was a really meaningful experience, even though we were there for a very short time. It was basically to show up and say, we're here. If you need anything, we're here. If something else happens, we're here. A couple weeks after that, we were invited to another community Shabbat dinner, because this was a time when a lot of that community building was happening. And as we were kind of getting ready to go, and all the moms in the room probably can relate to this, after telling Suleiman to put on his shoes for the 5th time, I was like, where are your shoes? And his response was, well, I have to get something from my room. And I saw him sort of run into his room and come back with this envelope that was filled with coins. And I was like, what is that? And he's like, it's my piggy bank, and I put it in this envelope. And I was like, why are you taking your piggy bank envelope to where we're going? And he said, I just want to take it in case this synagogue has their window broken too. And that story to me really sort of shows 2 things that have been on my mind for a long time. The first is we needed to, and I think we did, inculcate a sense of solidarity and neighborliness, and we're thinking about how to bring up our kids with a sense of civic duty in times of crisis, but also in times of normalcy. The second thing I realized in the second part of that story is that we couldn't leave the story at the victimization of our neighbors who we were standing in solidarity with. And it was important not to be stuck in a single story. And it was important not to only see people as defined by a single experience or a single way of looking at them. So I start with that story today because it's really important to think about how, and I love the language that you were using, Zina, and I wrote it down, which is, how can we settle a language into our heart that prepares us for moments like this? And the reality of that, I think, starts with you start preparing for that moment much, much, much before the moment actually confronts you. And it's actually a practice that we all have to commit to in order to hold ourselves accountable to those moments, in order to have courage in those moments, in order to have inspiration in those moments. So thank you for being part of this conversation. I prefer for this to be a dynamic conversation. We have community online with us as well. So there will be moments today when I will ask you to speak with your neighbors on your tables, and we will ask the online community to chat amongst themselves, even in the chat room. And we'll also ask for some conversation with all of us. And I may repeat some of your comments to make sure that they are captured online as well. So thank you for your patience in advance. So as I mentioned earlier, I work for an organization called Interfaith America. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context in the way that I come into this work. We're a nonprofit organization that believes that religious diversity is America's foundational strength. So the view that we take to a lot of the work that we do is coming from the space of that religious diversity, a community where people believe very differently. And for us, that includes traditional religious, organized religious traditions. It also includes worldviews such as secular humanism, such as atheism, etc., which is a way of thinking about the world and how you come into relationship with the community that you're part of. And we're hoping, Interfaith America's vision is to build a nation that achieves this promise of religious diversity in America towards a common good. So I just wanted to give you that as a foundation for the work that we do. We also deal with that as it intersects with other identities as well. So it is a conversation that is rich with lots of intersections, thinking about race, religion, gender, ethnic diversity, thinking about cultural histories and how our family histories really bring us into community with one another. This is a lovely picture of our fellows who are religiously diverse. So I wanted to give you a little picture of that. The way that we think about connecting to one another is through what we call building interfaith cooperation. And that really, I put that in front of you because these are the three sort of core elements that informs all of our methodology and approach. The first is respect for religious and non-religious identity. So it's thinking about who's in community with you, how you welcome them, how you're communally in space with them, how you learn about them, what do you know about them, etc. The second is building mutually inspiring relationships. So it's not just enough to know that people are in the space with you and to give them space, but it's also important to actually build a relationship, to actually understand why certain people show up in certain ways, to understand why do you believe that way, to understand how you are living out, what are the values that inspire you to live out your life in a specific way. And the third is common action for common good, which is saying that it's not just enough for us to have community and friendship, but it's also important for us to think larger than that and to think about how we are giving back to the spaces that we are part of, how we are building something together in the civic spaces. So our work is not so much into the theological aspect of what it means to have an interfaith community. It's more about the civic aspect of what it means to live in a community where lots of different people from different beliefs and backgrounds are coexisting together, and how do we build a community together that we share. So, bystander effect. Pastor Zina started talking about this a little bit earlier, which is when we are confronted with a situation, whether it's an immediate situation of distress, or it is a situation online, or it's a situation that you kind of see building, what is our role and how do we respond? So there has been a lot of data and research around this thing called the bystander effect, which is, in a nutshell, that when a single person is in a situation and there isn't another community around them, their reaction to that, whether it is danger or whatever it may be that they are confronted with, changes when you put other people in the room. All right? So we're gonna watch a video. It's an old video from the 70s that kind of demonstrates how our reaction to a situation may shift based on the circumstance around us. So this video does not have sound, it's just a picture. So what you'll see here is a room where a person is coming in to take a survey of some kind or fill out some paperwork, and they are in this room by themselves, and there is some suspicious looking smoke coming from the door, and we'll see what happens. Now we're going to see the same exact situation with a whole bunch of people in the room. What I love about this video is that there's literally one difference between the previous example and this one, and that is the other actors in the room for this unsuspecting person who is a part of this experiment. Five minutes have gone by, actually almost 6 minutes have gone by, and they're all still in the room, and there is still suspicious smoke, and we still haven't moved. So 70s. It is very 70s, it's very dated. 10 minutes have gone by, and they're still in the room. 20 minutes have gone by and they are still in the room. So you get the point. So I'm wondering, as you were watching that video, what are some thoughts that come to mind? And if you're in the Zoom room, would love to kind of have you put in the chat box what your thoughts are. So we can do this popcorn style here, and I'll repeat it for our online audience. What are some thoughts that that came to you as you were viewing that video? Yes.
Well, I think in the second scene, she obviously didn't have enough confidence in herself, and so she's looking around wondering what's the matter with me that they aren't responding to something.
Sure. So in the second part of it with the other people, she's kind of losing her confidence and doubting her judgment a little bit. She's gaslighting herself, right? She's kind of like, do I see the smoke? Do I not see the smoke? Is the smoke dangerous? Nobody else is moving. What's going on, right? So yeah, thank you for that. What are some other observations that you saw?
She doesn't want to stand out.
She doesn't want to stand out. She doesn't want to be singled out. That's great. Thank you. Yeah. She's looking for support. She's kind of like, does someone else see this? And she doesn't want to stand out. I thought I saw a hand up here. Maybe not.
That one.
Yeah.
People are more comfortable to keep things smooth than to be disruptive.
People are more comfortable to keep things smooth than to be disruptive. That's great. Because that actually is one of the main things that ends up being a barrier for bystander effect, right? Which is that you don't want to be the person who's the rabble rouser. You don't want to be the person who's disrupting the space. So you kind of are sitting and you're like, should I say something? Should I not say something? What's happening, right? Thank you for that. We'll do one more if there is one more. Yes?
I think sometimes you question your expertise. Like, she wasn't the one close to the door. That person has more expertise on that.
Yeah, so sometimes you question your expertise. That's a great suggestion, actually, because she's also not a person in power in that space, right? She's a participant. She's been invited there. There's obviously organizers. There's obviously people who put that together. So she's kind of like, well, if they're not freaking out, then I guess I won't freak out, right? So that is a good example as well. Thank you for that. Yes?
Well, I think in that same vein, the fact that as we put a great amount of trust in people we don't even know.
Yeah, thank you. So what you're saying is that even though we're uncomfortable and we're thinking about taking a step, there is an amount of trust that's assumed in the room. And since nobody else is moving, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to trust that the room is okay, that the room is safe, and I don't need to do anything. Thank you. Yes?
I kind of had the opposite in that fear.
Uh-huh.
Maybe not so much in that situation that others are going to say, what do you mean? There's no smoke. But if I stand up, what's everybody else? What's going to be directed at me, perhaps?
Sure. Yeah, so you're saying one of the things that occurred to you was the opposite of trusting the room, which is you don't trust the room and you're maybe not trusting yourself, and you're like, I'm not sure what's going to come at me if I stand up and take a stand in this particular moment. So thank you for that as well. Yes?
When children don't want to see something, they cover their eyes as if that can make it disappear.
Yes.
And I wonder how often we really don't want there to be trouble or distress, and we pretend.
Yeah.
It's a coping mechanism
Yeah.
that we just back away from.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you were saying how children, when they're afraid, will cover their eyes and kind of be an ostrich, right? And stick their head in the sand, and sometimes we do that too. And I think we're a culture that teaches that in some ways, right? Like how many times, I mean, again, I'm a mom, so like when we're in the grocery store and there's another kid like crying in the aisle, and my kid's like, what's happening in that aisle? I'm like, shh, walk around. And and we do that in some instances because we don't want to make people feel more embarrassed than they may already be. But also, I think what we do is we then are teaching children against their natural instincts, which is to be like, what's happening? What's going on over there? And we're telling them instead to not trust themselves and to not trust that if they do say something, they're going to be okay. Thank you for that. So I wanted to look at some common barriers for intervention, some common reasons why people don't speak up. And many of those were actually sourced here. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. The first is safety, is making sure, am I going to be safe if I speak up? Is it safe for me to actually say something? And I think this is a real concern, specifically depending on the situation that you're in, right? So there may be a situation in which it may not be safe for you to speak up as the bystander. It may be safer for somebody else to speak up. And that is a real concern. So navigating around that is a real concern. We'll talk a little bit about that in terms of when we talk about the list of things you can do as an upstander, which is also called bystander intervention in a different phrase. But when we talk about that, we'll talk about the opposite of that. So safety is really important. Another is diffusion of responsibility, which we heard about in various ways on this side of the room, right? Which is nobody else is getting up, so I don't need to get up. Everybody else seems to be calm, so I'm going to trust the room. I'm a little afraid to stand out, so therefore I'm not going to stand up. So diffusion of responsibility is very much part of all of those examples that we heard. There's also internalized biases. So there might be an internalized bias that we carry that keeps us from standing up. There might be, and I can use an example of this, like when, when we had first moved here and we were in the grocery store, my mom and myself, we both used to cover at the time. We both wore hijab. My mom still wears hijab. Hijab is the scarf that a lot of Muslim women cover their hair with. And we were at the local Target. And my mom speaks English. She's, has had a job in the United States. She's fully functional. And the person who was checking us out at the counter was speaking really, really loudly, like yelling, like really loudly. And there was a part where I was just like, we're not deaf. Like, we can hear you. Like, why are you screaming? And at that point, she was like, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you didn't speak English. And I'm like, and again, why are you screaming? So there are biases that we may have that may come to play when we're in a situation. So it's good to have that gut check as well. Unclear circumstances. This is really important because sometimes we don't have all the facts and we don't have all the information. And that becomes a reason for people to not step in. And I think it's really important in those moments to think about how do you appropriately step in and intervene even if you don't have all the facts and even if you may get some of them wrong. Right? And what does that mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about ways to come into space. And the last one is communal influence, which is we don't want to stand out from our family and friends. We don't want to be the odd one out. We don't want to disrupt the peace. And how can we think about bringing our friends along? And sometimes it's safer not to. It's safer not to be the person who's raising the question. So those are some of the common barriers that may influence you to not intervene. I wanted to give people a few minutes to kind of talk about the ones that you saw, and then maybe think about one of those that really speaks to you, that you're like, I've seen that in play, or that really resonated with me. And we'll do that for about, let's say, 3 minutes at your table. So it's going to be a super fast speed dating kind of situation. So have a conversation if there's 3 of you at a table, it can be a group conversation. If there's more than 3 of you, let's do it with a partner that's right next to you. Thank you. Let's hold on to some of those thoughts. Those will come in use for us later as we do some small group scenario work in just a minute. So I wanted to share a quick video with you about what it could look like to be an upstander in a situation. This particular video was produced a number of years ago, and it's specifically thinking about being an upstander in situations of violence or uncomfortable situations against women. So that's the context for this particular one, although I think the various strategies that they show applies to more than obviously just that particular scenario. So we're going to watch this video.
It's not okay. No, no, stop, no. No, stop, no.
All right, thank you for that. So you'll see a lot of the strategies that I'm going to talk about next really reflected in that video, which is, there's many different ways to be an upstander. There's many different strategies that you could use to be an upstander or an active bystander, as that video labeled it. And there's lots of curriculum written about this. This is Interfaith America's particular take on how you can show up as an upstander in a situation. So the first is directly connect with the person being targeted. This is like, for me, the golden rule of upstanding, which is you center the person being targeted. You do not center the person who is doing the attack or whatever that looks like, right? You don't center the person who is the aggressor. You center the person who is receiving that experience. And that's simply because that person gets to say how the consequences of that situation should roll out. So it may be possible, if you are in a situation that is truly, like there's imminent violence against someone and you intersect that, it's possible that that person says, actually, I do want to file a police report. And they get to do that. But it's also possible that person says, actually, I just want to go home and be with my kids and I don't want to do that. And they get to make that decision too, right? So the experience of the person who is being targeted is the experience to be centered. And that's the person to be centered in this situation. So directly connect with the person that is being targeted. The second step is create a diversion or change the subject. And you saw several examples of that in this video. And I would love to kind of crowdsource some of those. And if you are in the chat room, would love to have you put that in the chat group, in the chat box as well. What are some ways that you saw people in that video creating a diversion or changing the subject? And we can do this popcorn style. So speak up when you feel inspired. She just happened to be carrying a little bowl or a xylophone, right? Like something to make noise. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. The selfie with the selfie stick. Yeah, absolutely. There's another comment. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
It was creating space. So.
Yeah, it was literally creating space. Yeah. There was another comment on this side. Okay. What are some other ways that we saw people creating a diversion in the space?
Using their physical body to intervene.
Yeah, using their physical body to intervene to create that space. And actually, that's the next one, actually, using body language and positioning to shift the power dynamic, right? Whether it was the dude who was kind of moonwalking around to like physically then insert himself between the two individuals, or you could even say like the selfie stick was a way to do that as well. It's actually, they were like moving forward in order to put space between this woman and the person next to her. The fourth is locate people around you and enlist them to help, right? And I think we saw a little bit of that, but this is where I think it's really important. If you're somebody who can't intervene because intervening would not be safe for you, then it's kind of tagging someone in the space who you can say, I just saw this, can you go do that? And this is something in a very basic level, it's something I teach my kids, right? So if there's a bully at school that you see is bothering someone and you don't feel strong enough to go face them, like go tell a teacher, or go tell the lunch monitor, or go tell the playground monitor, or someone that you know is there and you can trust, or tag another friend and say, hey, let's go get her out of that situation, right? So there's ways to kind of build community and enlist people to come help you if you don't feel like you can step into that space yourself. And the fifth is to continue to support the victim. And what I mean by that is in that particular moment, but also afterwards, right? It's really, and if obviously that it's different based on the situation. If you're intervening in a situation with a stranger, someone on a bus, like we saw in the video, or at a grocery store, obviously you're not going to be able to keep in touch with them after that moment has passed. If it's someone in your community, if it's a neighbor, then there's a way for you to show up in solidarity with those folks and check in with those folks, right? There's a game that I like to play when we do our longer sort of training retreats at Interfaith America. It's called My People, which is you go around and you tell everybody who your people are. And I often say, my people are people who show up with roast chickens without being asked, right? They just show up to your house with some dinner and they're just like, I'm here. I can stay if you want me to, or I'll just drop dinner off if you don't want me to, right? So those are my people. So there's different ways to show support. A lot of our life these days is lived out online. A lot of our unfortunate bullying is also lived out online. So there is also a moment to think about, as we're living so much of our lives in public, in this shared online community, how do we show solidarity? And I think there's different ways to do that, and we've seen that. There's ways to silently show solidarity, which is to put up a banner on your picture, to share a particular fundraiser, to share a particular news story, and to have some words of support. And then there's also words of actually going to someone's space if they're on the receiving end of some of that online bullying, and actually giving them words of affirmation, giving them words of support, and kind of having that presence. So there's ways to think about and do that, and I think those are really important today, especially as we live in a culture where those online spaces are probably much more dangerous to us, or just as much dangerous to us as physical spaces are. So what I wanted to do is actually do some table conversation with a couple of scenarios, and to really think about which of those 5 steps that I described here would be steps that you would use in a situation like this, that you would feel called to use or comfortable using. And we'll do a couple of those scenarios, and then we'll kind of have a talk back with the whole group. Folks online, I believe we'll have somebody facilitating a conversation for you all in the Zoom room online together. So I would love to also hear some feedback from you all, and I'll ask our moderators to give me a couple of notes on the conversation there as well. So our first scenario, which we're going to do for about, let's say, 4 minutes, you're walking through the produce section of your grocery store when you witness a situation. You see a man yelling bigoted statements at a Muslim woman who is shopping with 2 younger children by her side. You hear the words, terrorist, and go back to your country, etc. What do you do? How was that conversation? What was a theme that resonated at your table? Was there a particular step to being a bystander that everyone was gravitating towards? Yes?
We were talking about intervention, walking up to that person and saying, hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in a while. How's it going? And you just start to talk to them and say, the kids are here too. How you doing, guys? And
yeah.
Kind of thing, and just see if that person just okay, you're not going where I'm thinking it's going, and they tend to leave.
Yeah, that's great. So just walking up to the person and saying, hey, how are you? And having a conversation with them like you know them, and sort of diffusing the situation that way. That's a great example. What are some other folks, other tables? What was resonating with you all? Yes?
So we all said that the directly connecting with the person being targeted was not what we would have naturally done for being here tonight.
Sure.
But we really saw the benefit of that in trying to help that person versus engaging with the negative person.
Sure. So you're saying before tonight you wouldn't have thought to actually directly connect with the person who was being targeted, but you're rethinking that strategy as maybe that would be a helpful way to diffuse the situation.
Because I would add fuel to the fire with the negative person. I say, hey, wait, you shouldn't be saying that. Come on. And that's just what you want. So.
Yeah.
But now, I like that strategy though. Hey, how do you think we're not seeing it all? Never. But but I could throw that in there.
Yeah, sure.
I like that, especially with the kids involved. We don't want it to get to be a whole thing.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Other examples? Yes.
Being the online crew.
Yes.
and sorry I missed the last part, so if it's redundant, but yes, having conversation about food, recipes, groceries, just changing the conversation to that.
Yeah, so engaging with the person and bringing bringing a subject and just having like a really robust conversation and not giving attention to the person who is yelling. Yes, thank you for that. So I actually wanted to tell you all another quick story before we go into the next scenario, which is, and this is gonna date me, y'all, I'm old. I'm older than I look. So I was a senior in college when September 11th happened. And at the time, I was a hijabi, I was a scarf-wearing Muslim woman, and I was a student leader in the community service space. I was a leader who led a group of students to go do community service every Thursday from campus. And because of that, one of the professors who was leading the service learning course asked me to come and talk a little bit about why I felt called to do community service as a Muslim and what got me engaged in that space. And I was walking into that class when we heard news of the first Twin Tower being attacked by the plane. And when I walked into that class, across campus, and 10 minutes later, or however long it was, we heard news of the second plane going into the second tower. And we knew very quickly that we were not going to be talking about Muslims being inspired to do community service in that room that morning. And as I was standing there, there was one young man who raised his hand on one side of the room, and he said, "Why do Muslims hate Americans?" And there was another young man who happened to be Muslim, who raised his hand and said, "Why does everybody think we had to do anything with this heinous crime?" And in that moment, as a 19, 20-year-old, I had no idea how to make that conversation a productive one. And it was very clear that we were not going to have a productive conversation in that room or in any room for a time. But when I left that room, I had 2 missed calls on my cell phone. The first was from my dad, who was like, get home now. And the second call was from he was a residence hall minister on campus and also was a mentor to me, who was a Catholic man by the name of Carl Nass. And he was basically calling to be like, what's your plan for today? Because I need to know what your plan is. So I met with Carl shortly after I left this class. And actually, before I met with Carl, I had to go back to my own class. And in my class, my professor, I will never forget that day, said, "If only we had no religion, then we wouldn't have this problem." And she looked at me as she said that. So I was feeling a little bit weird in the sense that suddenly, every single Muslim person on campus became a representative for a community of billions of people around the world. And suddenly, the action of these, this small group of men who created this horrible crime became the responsibility of this entire global community to carry. And it was in that moment that Carl came to me as a mentor and said, "I'm going to drive you home. You need to go home. You need to be with your people. You can come to campus later and do your thing that you need to do later. But today you need to go home." And I had a car on campus, so he followed me home in his car. And I live about an hour away from the city. At the time, my parents were living in Frankfort, Illinois. Bonus points if you know where that is. So Carl drove me back to Frankfurt, had some lovely tea that my mom made him when we got to our house, and then came home. And Carl and I are still friends. Carl still teaches a class about religion and service every semester, and that class comes through Interfaith America at the beginning of every academic year. And it's honestly the reason I share that story with you is because sometimes it's also a moment of looking at what is possible in terms of the harm that's coming and showing up in that space anyways, even if there isn't an immediate need, right? That is really the moment that I think has stuck with me for many years. And one of the reasons Carl and I are still friends is that particular moment and the solidifying of our relationship in that moment. We see a lot of those moments happening across the country, even when polarization is very, very deep and wide in this particular moment. And I want to share some of those stories as we bring this to an end. But before we do that, I would love to kind of go to a different scenario and have you all debrief a different scenario. So I'm going to skip the second one. we're going to do an online debrief. So this is a picture of an Interfaith America alum. Her name is Balpreet Kaur. She is a baptized Sikh woman. Sikh is a religious tradition that comes out of India. And a picture of her was posted on Reddit with the caption, "I don't know what to make of this." Everybody knows what Reddit is? Yes? Okay. Soon there are hundreds of messages on this Reddit channel making fun of her, questioning who she is or what she's doing, making assumptions about her age, about her gender, about her religious beliefs. There's a whole thing happening. And Balpreet obviously did not know that was happening. The reason she was alerted to it was because someone saw it on Reddit who knew her and called her and said, "Hey, there's a picture of you on Reddit and there's a whole bunch of commentary happening and it's not very safe and I just want to let you know," right? And if you were on a website, let's say you were on Facebook, or I don't use Reddit, but maybe you all do. If you were on Reddit or if you were on Twitter and you saw something like this happen, what would you do? How would you go back to some of these strategies, which are mostly thinking about in-person spaces? And what are some ways that you would interact and show up in that online virtual space as an upstander? I feel terrible interrupting your conversations because lots of conversations means you're actually enjoying this. So would love to hear a couple of comments. We're running a little short on time, so I want to make sure we get through the rest. So just a couple of comments about what were some of the strategies that you all discussed in terms of how you could show up as an upstander in an online setting. And we'll do this popcorn style again. And if there's any from the online space, we would love to hear that. Claire, do you want to share it first?
Sure, yeah. I wanted to say everyone was a little stymied. We asked each other questions about what we've seen, and I wanted to repeat one because I feel this too, that the scenario made someone really sad because this is happening in Barrington right now. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes?
This was not me, but Zina, who is amazing, obviously we all know that, but she said,
100%.
Brilliant, and she always is brilliant, but if you know someone who's making one of those comments, that you're connected somehow through, shared or whatever, that you DM them directly, like you don't embarrass them necessarily on the post, but you DM them directly and sort of question their reasoning behind that for them to think about it, and then that way it's someone they know that's kind of calling them out to make them rethink what they've posted, and I just thought that was really brilliant.
And it's happened to me. A friend of mine called me out on something I put up. So
Thank you. So what was being shared was that there was a situation where if you know somebody making a not so nice comment or like an aggressive comment online and you know them personally, then instead of calling them out in the public space, DM them and actually have a conversation with them and try to convince them to pull that comment back and maybe issue an apology or something like that, right? So kind of holding someone accountable that you know personally. So thank you for that. Yes?
It was your idea.
Oh, my idea? I think sometimes, it kind of to directly connect with the person being targeted. If you're online, just support, and you can say simple like peace, love to you, and kind of deflect some of that anger towards you, which you can handle and be like, okay, I'm going to ignore you and just kind of let that, go. But at the very least, show going back to support the person who is being targeted.
Yeah, so one strategy is instead of trying to take on the internet trolls or take on the aggressive comments, actually go with affirmations and positive comments and publicly support the person that's being targeted. So thank you for that. We'll do two more comments and then we'll kind of continue on. Yes?
I think most platforms have a way to report the issue, right? And so I think it's important that somebody's taking those steps to report it as a post or what have you, right?
Yeah.
That there are rules of engagement that are being violated.
Yeah, most platforms have, thank you. So most platforms have a way to report issues that come up. And so, that's another way to do that is to report someone who's being aggressive online and to actually do that. Was there another hand over here? Did I miss someone? Okay. I think I really like that. And I think the trickiness of what's happening with our online spaces these days is that oftentimes you don't know who's making the comments, right? You don't know if it's an actual person, you don't know if it's a Russian bot, you don't know if it's another person. I should probably be a little bit more politically correct when I say those things. But you don't know that. And actually we saw that, right, coming out of the 2016 election. We actually saw, so there's data and research that shows how non-real people accounts were actually pushing a lot of what was happening in the conversations in online spaces that really deepened polarization around our civic spaces. Literally, right? Like in person, they divided those spaces, they divided those communities, and oftentimes that was happening amongst people who are not in that community. So it's tricky, and I want to say that because I don't want it to feel like, oh, there's an easy fix to this online bullying, right? Like I don't want it to seem like this is not a really important problem to think about, and it's not a really important issue that is actually very complex and is difficult to tangle. But I think what we can do is really show up in that space with our humanity and recognize the humanity of the person who is being targeted. And if that's the only thing we do, but there's a lot of us doing it together, then there's power in that, right? If that's the only thing we do, but there's, for every aggressive comment, there's 10, 15, 20, 100 positive comments, there's power in that. So there's power in also showing up in community. Just like we show up with our feet, how do we show up in those virtual spaces to be in solidarity with people as well? So that's really important. I do have a funny story that I'll share, and I know I'm at time. So my 11-year-old thinks he's gonna be a YouTube star. He thinks this is his claim to fame. I have to say that it was very satisfying as a mother to have the one video that he made from me get the most views that he's ever gotten. So that was very satisfying. However, in the ways that he's interacting, and this is obviously, we monitor that very closely as his parents, he sort of got a comment from someone that was like, he had put a picture of him doing a flip at one of those bouncy house, whatever things. And someone put a comment that was like a little bit of a, oh, that's easy. Like, I don't know why you're making this such a big deal kind of a comment. It's somebody he didn't know. It was another kid online. And he kind of came to me. He's like, I got this comment. It's really bothering me. And I was like, okay. I'm like, did you see who it is? And I'm like, do you know this person? And he's like, no, I don't know him. But it's okay. I went to his account, and he only has 2 followers, and I have 50 followers. So it's fine. And I was like, okay. And he's like, but I think I want to say something to him. And I was like, do you need to say something to him? And it was one of those questions where it's also, and this is specifically with online spaces too, is we have to keep in mind as we show up for other people that we are then not becoming the aggressors, right? So it's not dehumanizing also the person that you're coming to be a barrier with. So it's important to kind of think about and really kind of think about how you're calling people into space rather than pushing them out of space. And I will say that sometimes that can be tricky because sometimes somebody needs to leave a space. But I think there's also a way to invite them to step away from that space that is an invitation, that is not a casting out, right? So that is something that I'll leave you with as you're pondering the way that we show up with community online, which is a very tricky and difficult thing to navigate. And I know that that's sitting on some people's minds, as we heard in the comments here. So as we transition to the Q&A part of this conversation, I wanted to quickly share just one line by Rumi, since I started with him. Where there is ruin, there is hope for treasure. And the reason I love this quote is because it is only when we are broken open that we see new possibilities. It is only when we break cycles and systems and look at them a little closer and look at all the pieces that we're able to think about how do we rebuild, and how do we rebuild in a way that is going to be life-giving? How do we rebuild in a way that is an invitation and not a barrier? And how do we rebuild in a way that really brings out the gifts that we have as a community and that calls people into that space to actually be with one another?
We will come to your questions in just a moment. Jenan, the question that is in my heart is, when we were talking about the scenario in the grocery store, and you indicated that sometimes people just don't want to see what's going on, how do we teach people to see, even if they don't have the language settled in their heart? How do we avoid the ostrich, even if you don't know what to do to act?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I feel like so much of, so there's such a paradox in terms of specifically communities who feel, communities and when I say communities, I mean religious communities, I mean communities of gender, sexuality, etc. There's so much invisibility, right? In a lot of ways, folks who have, or if there's a culture of non-belonging sometimes for certain opinions, for certain identities, etc., a lot of times the way that that shows up is actually not with aggression. A lot of times it shows up with invisibility, right? We just don't see you in the room, right? And so I think the most important thing to do is to literally recognize somebody's humanity. And even if you don't have the language or the words or the training or whatever, smiling at someone in a space like that can bring somebody solace. And this is where, in Islam, there's a teaching from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said, even a smile is charity. So even a smile is something that is counted as a good deed for the person who is giving that to someone else, because that can bring somebody comfort in a very difficult time, even without words, even without knowing someone, right? So I think that there's a way of seeing the world, and it's important to see people's humanity. And I say that, as someone who's been on either side of these kinds of situations, and I don't mean just as someone who's Muslim. Obviously, for a long time, a lot of women who look a certain way. I don't wear hijab anymore. I did wear hijab for about 20 years of my life. It's very difficult to be in public spaces because you're very invisible, and yet you are so visible. And that is, I think, that place of, it's very disorienting, right? Especially for young people, it's very disorienting. And that, to see somebody's humanity is the biggest gift you can give them in that space, even if you don't have the language or the relationship or an ability to intervene in that moment.
That's powerful, just to see someone, just to see them and to acknowledge them.
I am still a learner in all of this, and so I feel like I'm sitting over at the table and I'm like, okay, well, what would I do? And it's like, yeah, I have no idea what I would do in this moment, and I would probably want to just crawl into a hole and pretend that I'm not in the space while it's happening. So, beginner over here. You were talking about how we are dealing with people. How do we respond to people within a space? Is there ever a time when a boundary has been crossed where a person does need to be told no? Is there ever a time where, you talk about like we don't want to cast people out, but is there ever a time like when is that moment, or is there ever a moment where we have to actually put down our feet and say, no, this is not okay?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you
sure.
discern that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's important is, so what the question you're asking me is bringing me to also realize, and maybe I didn't say this very clearly, accountability needs to happen. Whether it happens in the moment of crisis or it happens later, accountability needs to happen. And accountability can look different depending on the situation. And it's possible that the same way to hold one person accountable in a particular stance is not the same as something as if it would be a different person doing something similar, right? So I think accountability is a given. Like that's not something that can go on or that can go without happening. I think the community, however you may define that, whether it's a room, whether it's a family, whether it's like a communal space, like a village or a town, whether it's an online space, there has to be, we all live with shared rules and values, right? We all kind of agree to that. Even if they're not stated, there is an understood agreement. I will be safe in my house. My kid is safe in their school. My family can practice the religion that they want to comfortably. We can't impose that on other people, but we are comfortable in the way that we can show up in that space as a particular community. So there's certain understandings of that. And when that gets broken, it's important to recognize that something is broken. And to then ask the question of, what does it mean to repair this? And sometimes that repair can be easy. Sometimes that repair is an apology, and it's a conversation, and then you can move on, right? Sometimes that's not enough. And we have to be okay with that. Like, we have to be okay with the fact that sometimes the apology will not be enough. Sometimes the attempt to repair will take a lot longer. Sometimes the person who maybe created the aggression or the harm may not be willing to apologize. And if they are not, then do you just stand? Like, do you not move forward from that space? And there always has to be a way to kind of continue to move forward. So I can give an example of this, choosing my words very carefully. I'll use an example of this with my own son. So my 11-year-old came home from, poor guy, I use him all the time. It's a good thing he doesn't watch my speeches, because he's gonna be like, what are you doing, Mom? He comes home a few months ago, he's in 6th grade now, and says, I joined this club, and I kind of noticed that his water bottle is continuing to grow in rainbow stickers. And obviously, as a mom, like, I know what that means. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So eventually I was like, so tell me about this club that you're part of. What is it called? Why are you part of it? And he was like, oh, it's a club that supports, it's an allyship club. And I was like, okay. I was like, that's a big word. So what does that mean? And he's like, that means we support other people. And I was like, okay, so what kind of support are you doing in this club? And he's like, well, we support people who are LGBTQI. And I was like, okay. And he seemed very hesitant as he was telling me the story. So I was like, this is interesting. So I was just like, I feel you're hesitant. Tell me why you're hesitant. And he's like, well, my friend so-and-so told me that I shouldn't be part of this club because Muslims don't like gay people. And it was one of those moments where I was just like, I can't tell him that's not true, because it is true, because a lot of conservative communities struggle with supporting people who are part of the gay community. I can't tell him that he should be part of it and he should not worry about that, because there are people in my family, even though me as a person, I consider to be a very devout, committed Muslim, and I consider myself to be someone who shows up as an ally in those spaces. So I was sitting with him kind of thinking about, what is it that I want him to leave with this space? And then there's this person who is telling him that he can't be part of a space because of this bias that this kid has, right? So we kind of just had a conversation about that. And I was like, you can be part of the space. You can support your friends who have invited you to be part of the space. And you should know that there are some people in our family who may not be supportive of this community. And that's okay. They're still our family, and we're going to let them know that we believe differently from them. We're going to let them know that we support this community if that ever comes up. And we're going to be people who create safe spaces, and we're going to be open about that. It's not a secret. We're not going to hide it. And we're going to sit in that complexity, and it's not always going to feel good, right? It's not going to feel good. And it's not going to be kumbaya. And it's not going to be like, we're not going to feel good about this. And that's okay. Because we'll still do the thing that we know is right for us, and we'll still show up and protect spaces, and we'll still show up to our Thanksgiving table and love our family and tell them when they're wrong and disagree with them when we think that they're wrong. And we just need to sit with that. And that's just how it's gonna be. And it was interesting because when you're 11, you see the world in black and white. You see the world as good or bad. You're with us or you're against us. And to introduce this level, I was a little nervous about that. And he was kind of just like, okay, that's fine. And I was like, so what are you gonna go tell your friend? And I was like, I'm just gonna go tell him that not everybody believes that way. And And I'm still going to be nice to him, even though he believes differently, but I'm going to be part of this group. So I was like, that's great. You should do that. And I think that's where a lot of times I think our children can teach us how to deal with these complexities. Because in some ways, and to use very Muslim language, children have something called fitra, which is like their innate natural being. That is their guide, right? It's before they're completely influenced by the world and before they're fully formed in the environment that raises them. And they're able to give us these nuggets where they can actually hold a lot of nuance and complexity while asking for fairness, while asking for black and white, while asking for justice. And at the same time saying, okay, like I can work with this. I can figure out how to work with this. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but I hope so.
I think you answered a lot of questions. What I appreciate is how your son walked away with the simple answer.
Right.
But you took the time to demonstrate the complexity and the depth of complexity and the nuance. And I think that that's really important, at least for me, is, making sure that everyone's seeing that it's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray in areas, and it takes a lot of thought, to get through it. But I'm calling your son for the summary of everything.
You said a moment ago that some things can't get better until they're broken open.
Mm-hmm.
So when you said that, what I thought was us, that none of us can get better until we're broken open. So what it made me think of, first of all, it made me think of Japanese pottery, kintsugi. That kintsugi means golden joinery. You've seen these beautiful pots that are broken and then put back together with lacquered gold. And the lacquered gold runs through the pottery, and they're stronger and more valuable after the process of kintsugi. K-I-N-T-S-U-G-I. Google it. It's a fabulous story. So I'm imagining one way we are broken open is when we fail. When we see something that we know is wrong, gut-wrenching know it's wrong, and we are silent. That's failure. What do we do with it? If I'm not better until I'm broken open, if I'm not better until I fail, then what do I do on the other side of the failure?
Yeah. You have to sit in it for a minute. And there's a, so I'm gonna go back to my roots as a Muslim. There's a Muslim story of when the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Prophet, is raised in Mecca. He's from Mecca. He's persecuted in Mecca. He migrates to the city of Medina that embraces him. And then as he is, in the city of Medina, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the community of Muslims is growing, they go to war with the tribes in Mecca. And there comes a point where they just can't continue the warfare. There needs to be something that breaks, right? So they go into this treaty, they go into this room, and they're in conversation. And a person from the tribe of the Quraysh, which are the opposing tribe, they're writing this peace treaty for a truce. And the prophet's companion says, write, Muhammad, the messenger of God. And the opposing person says, no, write Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. He's not the messenger of God for us. So and the companion looks at the prophet like, you're going to let him do that to you? And the prophet instructs him to strike it out and to write, the son of Abdullah. So he does that. And then this happens for a while. And this is called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And then they leave this treaty with a truce that says they're not going to be at war for a number of years. And the prophet's companions are just devastated, right? They're just devastated because they're like, how can we leave this without victory? Like, how can we walk away from this potentially as losers? Like, we just signed a bunch of stuff away. You struck out that you were the messenger of God. Like, how did you let him do that? And this is why I love women. The prophet goes into his tent, and his wife says to him, go do the thing you want them to do. Go and do the actions you want them to do right now, and they will follow you. Don't talk to them. Don't give them a lecture. Don't ask them, don't they believe in you? Go do the action that you want them to do, and then they will follow you. So the prophet goes out, and this is, during the time of Hajj, which is the pilgrimage that you make. And they were not able to make Hajj because they were not allowed entry into Mecca because of the treaty and the war. So he goes out and he still does the rituals. He still sacrifices the lamb. He still cuts his hair. He still changes, he does all of the ritual that is required of the pilgrimage, but without doing the pilgrimage. And then the companions follow him. So when I say we have to sit in it for a minute, I think we have to, what's important in failure is to hold ourselves accountable. I think it's important not to wallow in that accountability, but it's important to hold yourself accountable and then to take the action that you want to see happen. And the hope is that will have a moment of catching on, right? That'll have a moment of reproduction, that others will follow your example. But sometimes it just means that you're the only person who ends up doing that. And we have to be okay with that too, right? Like sometimes it means that you're the only person seeing whatever injustice it is and staying accountable to yourself maybe only, and that's okay too. And so to come back to my Muslimness, sorry guys, that's how I'm raised. There's another hadith, which is a saying of the Prophet that says, if you can't change something with your hand, then change it with your money. And if you can't change it with your money, then change it with your intention, right? So if the only thing you can do is to say, I'm gonna learn and change the way that I think about this, even that is a contribution to change. Because then the family that you raise, the community that you interact with, they still see the fruit of that change, even if it's only within you and you have not spoken to anyone about it, right? So that's the basic way that you hold yourself accountable to change. And I will say, when Trayvon Martin was murdered, I'm not sure I did anything. I read the news, I talked to my friends, but I'm not sure I went to anything, I contributed in a way that was really meaningful. It weighed on me. Suleiman had just been born, he was a baby. And it was heavy. And then when it happened again and again and again, there was a way to kind of think about, okay, what can we do? Okay, we can show up for a protest. We can put something online. We can do this, we can do that. And that culminates, and sometimes that takes years, right? So when we come to 2020 and George Floyd is brutally murdered, I live on the south side of Chicago, and we saw these mass protests happening in the city. And a lot of people who were protesting peacefully. And were showing up, to give their opinions and to register their call for accountability and to register their call for justice. And then there was also a lot of anger and a lot of pillaging. And there's a lot of opinions about that. I'm not going to engage in a conversation about whether it's okay to pillage the target or not. Like, I know that there's lots of opinions about that. And personally, that's not a choice I would make. But there's legitimate peaceful protests also happening alongside. And understandably, the mayor shuts off the city to the access to the city. So all the bridges in Chicago, if you're familiar with Chicago, go up. All the highways that go into the city, into Lakeshore Drive, are closed. And my community is right outside of that segment that was cornered off. So the protests come south to Hyde Park, right? And we're kind of like, okay, like we don't know how this is gonna go. And I was still married at the time, and my then husband served on a local community board, and he was the local community board president. So he gets a call from this group, it's a group of activists who are basically like, we're looking, and there's a curfew in Chicago, so there's a curfew for 7 p.m. And there's like, we're looking for safe houses for the protesters to go to if they're stuck in Hyde Park, because the CTA has been shut off. The trains are not working, the cars can't get in and out, so they don't have anywhere to go. So can you help us find a place? And so I call the person I know who will answer my call, which is a pastor. who is a friend and a colleague at Interfaith America. And I'm like, who do you know on the South Side? Who can we call? Because it's the middle of COVID. Everything's closed. All the safe houses, all the worship spaces are closed. Nobody has been in congregation for about 6 months. We're in the middle of the most active part of the pandemic at this point, right? The summer of 2020. And so I'm just on the phone calling pastors for like almost 2 hours. And then finally, one of the pastors says, you know what? We can open our church. We don't have much there. Can you drive some stuff over? So we quickly activate a couple of other people to drive over some water bottles, to drive over some sleeping bags, to drive over a bunch of things. And my ex-husband, Ali, had to break curfew to drive the stuff over. So we did that, and we arranged for that to happen. And I say all of that because would I have done that 10, 20 years ago? I don't know. But for me, it really was important in that moment to think about, not as a 26-year-old, but as a 40-some-year-old, I have the network to make something happen in this moment. So I'm not going to say, this is too hard right now.
So the failure becomes an opportunity to learn for the day that is yet to come.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we open, or do you? All right. What are your questions? And we have to run around with a mic. Okay.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment about what you were just talking about in a sense. Only? Oh, really? Just questions only? Oh, okay. Is that Trayvon Martin, to a certain extent, was sort of an abstract, because as opposed to George Floyd, I was at Citizens Park on that Saturday. I went down to 67th and Cottage Grove on the Sunday and marched, and it was a whole different thing. I mean, because, yeah, you're talking about being younger at the first time and being older. I was old in both times. So so the thing is that I think it really resonated with seeing that and really putting people, to do something, at least for me, to do something. So that's all.
Thank you.
Questions?
All right. My question is about, I find sometimes people get a little more courageous, braver, and sloppy casual when they're not in the same space with someone, when maybe talking stereotypically with bias about a group of people in private. So when I don't know if this counts as upstanding or if it's a different word, but when you're in a situation when you overhear other people maybe demeaning a group of people unfairly, how do you think about that kind of situation? Maybe any tips, even from the room, about like what mindset you have if you're not checking in with the person who's being attacked because they're not there, but you're speaking on behalf of somebody?
Yeah. I like to say if you're in a room with your loved ones, there's got to be space for real talk. So if there's ever a space where you can just say things really plainly and you're not as concerned about hurting people's feelings, it has to be some of those spaces, right? And I know that for a lot of people, some of those spaces are also tricky in that way, where not everybody has a safe space with their family or their loved ones or their friends where they can speak plainly and just be very, very direct in that way. And if that is not an opportunity, then I think my reaction is to actually reframe the story. So if you hear somebody saying biased things about a particular group of people, tell a story about somebody that you know from that group and be like, actually, my experience is kind of different. Instead of being like, you're wrong and that's racist, you can do that if you have that relationship to be able to do that. And if you don't feel like that's something you can do, then I think it's what's important is to reframe it and to say, actually, I know I have a friend so-and-so and they're part of that community and they actually did this with me when I was 11 and it's great. Or I went to college with so-and-so and it's not like that at all. And I actually have a different. So it's not to say you're wrong, it's to say, actually I have a different story about that community. Let me tell you that story. And reframing that.
Can I ask a follow-up? If you're with other people that are friends who think they're acting as a good upstander, but are mimicking the aggression that they're here. You know, I see this a lot online. I see people try to defend, like thinking that they're upstanding, but actually are pretty aggressive and kind of mimicking
Yeah.
what we want to not perpetuate. Have you seen any effective conversations between friends like that to kind of guide someone against doing that?
Yeah. So you're seeing me hesitate to answer that question because I think it's important to recognize there's such a thing called righteous anger. So sometimes it's okay to be angry. I think what's important is how does your anger show up in spaces? And if your anger is going to alienate someone else, then maybe that's not the best way to use your righteous anger. But if your anger is to ask for accountability, then I think that that's important, right? So I think it's important to ask for accountability. What I think happens often online, often with armchair activists, often with communities that feel very comfortable dehumanizing people because they're not a body in front of you that you have to say something to. It's very easy to say something dehumanizing to someone online, right? It's very easy to take away their humanity and to put them as objects. And that I think it's important to call somebody into action. So I'm just gonna say it. So this happened to me recently where I'm going through a divorce and there was a certain person in my community who decided she would say something about me in an online forum. And, you know, people didn't quite do the math to recognize that she was talking about me until finally like it clicked for some people. And then basically what ended up happening is someone who isn't my best friend, who doesn't know me very well, but knows of me because we're in professional spaces together, kind of interjected and said, that's not okay for you to do here. You need to go figure out what's happening in your life, lady, but that's not okay for you to do here to another person. So it wasn't saying you can't be in that space. It wasn't saying you need to leave this space. It wasn't saying, you know what I'm saying? So it was more kind of saying like, it's not okay for you to do that to someone else here.
It was the behavior, not the person, that they didn't say,
Exactly.
you're bad. They said, what
Exactly.
you're doing is not acceptable here.
Exactly. And you clearly are going through something, so you need to go figure out what that is. Not judging you on that, and you can't do that to somebody else in this space. So I think it's important to actually hold people accountable, but in that accountability, not stripping them of their humanity.
I'm curious, this is a question to the room. If you can call to mind, I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud, because that could hurt. If you can remember a time when you gave in to invective or bias, when you talked about a group, take your pick, when you decided to use that kind of group speak and demean some group. Again, I'm not going to ask you to say it, but I really want you to go there. Because in that moment, I have 3 family members, one who's passed, and 2 other family members who are very, very active in drug culture in a way that harms their bodies. And my brother-in-law has passed away, and there are a couple of other family members. And so when I begin to talk about active, the way in which drugs can infiltrate very successful people's lives and take them down, I have virtually no grace or sympathy. I have a 28-year-old grandson who was sitting right over there last month, and a 21-year-old niece, and I was having this conversation with them because they're things that are legal now in lots and lots of places, and they were trying to teach me about psilocybin as if I didn't know what ayahuasca was. They just don't know who I am. And we got into this argument because I was triggered around these experiences with other family members, right? And I was saying about a group of people who are joined in a particular way, really pretty hateful things. And these 2 young people, both of whom love me deeply, right, just kind of looked up. And my niece said, you wouldn't allow us to talk about any group like that. How come you get to do that? Yes, well, she is my niece. And it was really important Because whenever I get ready to get mad at you for talking about a group of people, I go right back to that place. And the reason I really want you to sit in it and to feel when you've done this is because we all have those groups and those folks. We all have somebody we're angry at, and we don't want to be on the face of the earth for whatever set of reasons. And rarely have we done the work to really understand that story. We have a single story. Even if you're right about the group you're mad at, the exercise of figuring out how I got there with language in my mouth that I'm not proud of and how you got there can sometimes give us just enough space to offer, grace may be too strong a word, but to offer an opportunity to be curious about how other people got there. And when I can get curious about why you're so hateful about X, if I can get curious, then I get to ask questions in a very different way. And whether I can sway you or not, that's not the point, but it's to seek to understand, one of our principles. So I share that because it was very painful as these two young people whom I adore were sitting in my home and calling me out. But it also put me in touch with how other people can get in that place. And it was really formative for me. So I invite you to go to the dark place and the dark folk that you don't want on the earth and imagine being curious about that. What do you think about that story?
I mean, you're amazing. So, and they all agree with me. So, you know,
I just make a lot of mistakes that I can't talk about.
I think it's really hard to sit in that dark place. And I think it's really hard to sit there and not be lost. Mm-hmm. And the difference, I think, in the people who are able to sit there for as long as they need to and then be out of it is to actually have someone with you to pull you out, for whom that is not their dark place, right? So to actually have someone with you in that space who, for them, that's not their dark space. Their dark space is something else, but they're with you. Mm-hmm. And then they let you sit in it because they're helping you hold accountability with yourself. And then they also have the grace to pull you out of it and to say, okay, now what? What next? Mm-hmm. What's gonna happen now? And to ask you those questions so you think about, okay, now what next? And to turn that light switch on.
I'm going to try and make this a question. What do you think about the advice I was given once, that you are not responsible for changing someone else's opinion, but you are responsible for letting them know that you have a different opinion?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that is, certainly a huge part of how at Interfaith America we think about bridge building work, which is coming into community with people who have shared values with you, but also have really deep difference. And to not shy away from those differences. So oftentimes, we all have the rule, right? You show up at dinner, you don't talk about religion or politics, right? But it's really sort of creating a community where we talk about the things we have in common and the things that we like, but the differences but there are differences among us that we also don't like. And it's important to give them some oxygen. It's important to recognize them. It's important to make sure that is present and recognized in the space. Because that invisibility, like not showing your difference of opinion, also gives license to opinions that can be harmful sometimes, right? So even saying you have a different opinion than someone can just be a way to see another aspect of the situation. Or in a lot of times in our world, it can be a way to see a person and to bring them into the room and not just have them represented as a stereotype or as an opinion or as a bias. So thank you for sharing that.
I have an Apple Watch, and it's really kind of annoying because among the things it tells me to do is stand up, right? You all have Apple Watches. I've stood up 14 times today, so we're cool today. You have to stand up at least 12 times and walk around. It's a crazy measure. But here's what I've decided to do with my Apple Watch after tonight. That when it tells me to stand up, which it just does, I'm going to ask what I've stood up for that day. That's going to be my reminder to ask myself 12 times a day, have I stood up for anything today? Have I stood up for anyone today? If you've got an Apple Watch, I invite you to join me. If you don't have an Apple Watch, you all have heard me say this ad infinitum. I'm so glad there's a sister here this is her first night. You're the only person who hasn't heard me say this. My grandfather, at the end of every night that we spent with him, and he tucked us in, asked 2 questions. What'd you learn and who'd you help? Every night you spent with Peter James, that's what he asked his grandchildren. What did you learn and who did you help? Big Dad, I'm gonna shift it a little bit, but what did you learn and for whom did you stand? Literally, if we were to ask ourselves that question as we put our heads on our pillows, and on the days that you stood for no one or nothing, note it and sit in it. And then determine that in the days to come, that number will change. I am convinced that there is no act too small to do if it is for the good and the right. The smile, the nod. You all know I put my hands together often when I greet somebody because I want that to be a sign of peace. Maybe that's it. There's no act too small, so that when you get in bed and ask, for what did I stand? It might be something small, but it changes the face of the earth. You gave us 2 hours tonight. Give those back to the world, and the world will be different. Thanks for coming, friends. Good night. We thank you.